So Angus is going to tell us something about contemporary interpretive architecture and landscape architecture in Europe. Him and his team made a survey across Europe to try to see, is there such thing as interpretive architecture, and what they found in Europe, they summarized in this little presentation. So I hope we will hear about that. Angus, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to present a point in a project of the architecture group, interpretive architecture group. We are preparing a brochure which is aimed at architects and landscape architects. And part of that process has been establishing which architects are already on message. Is interpretation being used in the architectural planning process? Find some good examples of this, and see how far we can apply our language of interpretation, the themes and buzzwords and ideas which circulate in all aspects of our guiding and writing and graphics and scenography and so on, how they actually apply to architectural planning. And I don't believe this has been done to any great extent. There are good examples, but a lot of architects are actually unaware of what heritage interpretation means. And so we're looking for language, a common language. It doesn't mean that they're not architects who are doing very good heritage work already, to a greater or less extent interpretive. But anyway, I'll show you our current findings, observations, examples. It's not anything definitive. There are thoughts and ideas and critical observations which have arisen, and I'd like to share some of those with you. So I'll share my screen. There we go, and start the presentation. So I include landscape architecture whenever I say architecture, just to keep it brief. What is interpretive architecture? At the moment, we have this great slogan for Interpret Europe's understanding of heritage interpretation, inspiring meaningful connections with Europe's natural and cultural heritage to shape our common future. So how does this apply to architectural practice? For me, interpretive architecture is architecture which relates to something beyond itself. This might be nature, it might be cultural history, it might be something intangible, like a historic event, or something going on in present cultural arenas. And the architecture would then respond and relate, and all those things we're familiar with in interpretation through the built environment, through the built object. So we'll go straight into the examples. An example close to home for me, and a lovely place to visit actually, is the Glencoe Visitor Centre in Argyll. My examples are not so contemporary. We wrote to over 30 of the best examples we found on the internet, and I'm just showing you the projects we got back where we have permission from the architects and explanation. So Gaia Architects went all in for an environmental ethic. Now, I'm going to start perhaps with one of the most difficult aspects of my talk, which is the architectural design being equivalent to a guided visit to a site. So the architect or the architecture takes the place of the guide, and in doing that gives the visitor a vicarious experience, which means they experience something through the medium of someone else. Not the guide in this case, but the architecture. So the architecture leads you in, it gives you an immersive experience and gives you a certain ethic in the sense of values surrounding the view you're getting of that site. And in this case, it was very, very strong. Gaia architects are utterly dedicated to a soft touch, leave no trace approach to the landscape and to the site. And you can see all this building is on stilts because they didn't want to build into the ground. They just wanted to float on it, as it were. And the materials all, as far as possibly, locally sourced and built so that they can be taken away again at the end of their lifespan without leaving a trace. And the whole thing is embedded in the form of a traditional Scottish village or clachan within existing mature trees and a water system coming off the mountain. And in a lovely way, you're immersed in this straight off as you enter the building. And you can see even existing trees have been integrated into the boardwalk. And the instant feeling is of the site of Glencoe, not yet the historic aspect of the site, but the natural landscape. So an immersive experience in the real thing and an environmental ethic purveying the tour which you receive there. Nice little details such as the design language echoing the landscape around the peaks and catching the light. We'll move on to the next example, which is in Portugal, the interpretation center for the Battle of Atoleiros. Now, all my examples are actually interpretation centers because they have consciously taken the task of interpretation, and it was easiest to find good examples of architectural interpretation at visitor centers. But of course, there are also lots of other good examples around. Now, this one commemorates a battle. That's, for me, an intangible heritage. It's an event which has taken place, wrapped up, packed away long before any of us arrived in the world, and there's actually very little left of it. So this heritage has to be remembered in other ways and experienced in other ways. You can't actually be immersed in the real thing, probably just as well. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the visitor site at Culloden. There we have a similar challenge. So they use artistic efforts to stand in for the original event, the original experience. And in joining into this scenario, you are experiencing it in some way. And they also use narrative. And so let's see how they do that outside. And here I mean narrative in the sense of sculptural, spatial design. They take a large massing in two parts. So you could say there's one army facing another army, and where you enter is in the middle. And the roundabout is the reddish landscape, the plain where the battle took place, symbolized by this urban park in the front. And then the chaos and confusion and forces of a battlefield represented by these seating objects around about and the disturbed geometry that you experience at the front, and a little of the native grasslands in between. And then something which I'm quite fond of here is to create a space for reflection where even if you're in a large group, you can sit down and gather your thoughts and contemplate what you've seen in the exhibition, how the open space, the battlefield outside, works on your thoughts and feelings. So creating space for reflection, lovely use of the corridor and the large windows in this place. And maybe you can, on a busy day, this park will be full of people, and you can actually apply your inner eye of the battle to the confusion of tourists arriving and buses and so on. It's a technique sometimes used in television by Andrew Marr, for example. He's quite fond of that one. Here it is again from another viewpoint. Now the next project is in the Netherlands, and we're looking at the Institute for Sound and Vision. And anyone who's possessed an old radio will have seen Hilversum marked on it, where particularly after the war, a lot of good new music was broadcast and was a popular channel. But this place is the archive for basically the entire collection of TV and radio and recordings available to the Dutch state. Now you might ask, how can you actually experience that? How can you have an authentic experience entering this building? Well, have a look at this. The architects took vision, the television images, iconic images from the past have been applied by the artist onto the screen facade. And these are visible at different times of day in different forms and to a different extent. And so you're instantly hit by a very visual, very exciting, really challenging facade. And when you go in, it's even more dramatic. And so the use of surprise and stimulating space, where you're shaken out of your day-to-day automatic way of going through life, and then you open your eyes and you open your ears, and I know that what you hear in there is also interesting, because there's a cut right down to the bottom basement floor. I think there are 7 floors underground containing the archives, and everywhere is very beautifully lit. So the whole thing is an audiovisual experience. This is the cinema. There we go. So they've taken let's say the medium is the message. They've taken the medium of TV images and transferred it into architecture. So it's almost the real thing, not quite. Now the next example is in Poland. The Museum of History of Polish Jews, Polin, by architects from Finland, Lademla and Malameki. Not sure if I pronounced that correctly. They won the competition. They do lots of great stuff for interpretation centers, by the way, around the world. And this one is on the site of the very heart of the Polish ghetto, which was destroyed in the Second World War. And it's also located next to the monument, the existing monument to the Holocaust and the ghetto. And so it's quite a somber location. It's in the middle of Warsaw, and the architects chose deliberately to do a rather low-key, modest atmosphere there. So it's not dramatic and exciting like the last one, or like the Jewish Museum in Berlin, for example, by Liebeskind. It's rather sober and reflective, and it picks up on its surroundings, but it gives you some surprises inside. You step inside and you get quite a different story. So again, we have surprise, we have a desire in the visitor to explore and to see what it's about, but it's not explicit. We're not talking about a narrative here. We're talking about a stimulus, really, and a sculptural expression of which you might or might not connect with historical events, but is certainly very thought-provoking. And this is described here. I'll just quote a little bit from the architects, that the building is cut through with a soft undulating gorge, connecting the monument to the uprising with the park and the city. In one sense, the form looks to evoke ideas of the parting of the Red Sea and the cracks in Polish Jewish history, whilst at the same time it's meant to only suggest this and more allow the visitor to attach their own symbolism to it. So this is what Torsten was already talking about, that the visitor is free to make their own associations, to create for light their own connections and a narrative. But the mood of the place, the atmosphere, is very pertinent to the subject matter, and that's an excellent starting point. So it's like reality itself. You step into a landscape, there's no script. There are no signs telling you what you're looking at or how to feel, and you're responding. And so this is architecture which is very visceral. It stimulates on a very deep level. Also a little disorientating, which is not such a bad thing. You have to reorientate yourself, and it stimulates then original thoughts and feelings. So the next example is in Norway, and we have the Utsikten viewpoint. Now in Norway, the National Tourist Routes invested a huge amount of money in dramatic viewpoints dotted up and down the landscape in unlikely positions. I mean, really extraordinary, some of them. And this one we'll look at is at Gaula Mountain, one of the most dramatic of them all, where the visitor is introduced to what the architects, I think most people would consider the most important themes of this location. Is on a mountaintop or very high up. We have the peak theme, we have the vertigo, we have the views. And so we have an abstract form which expresses this thrust, this direction, this panoramic vantage point. And like an eagle's nest, it perches on the landscape. Look at that. And they've even got a point where the cars can perch, and you can have a look before driving on. You can get out and sit also as a group, and then go down the steps, maybe to a lower point. And for me, this is a very good example of putting an emotional stamp onto an experience where if it wasn't enough to be up a mountain like this, the interpretive viewpoint actually heightens that experience to an almost unbearable degree. So the emotional stamp on your memory becomes very deep, and you remember this place because you felt fear or excitement there, and it was particularly heightened. So this idea of experiencing yourself at a site as a way of learning about it and opening yourself up to it is, I think, a very good one, very well expressed here, that we consult our feelings about a place in order to come to some viewpoint or some learning experience. And learning through the body, well, here it's the emotion of fear and excitement, adrenaline, which gives you that that push really. So again, the medium is the message, and it's more an emotional level than anything else here. There you go. One more example around the corner here in Berlin is the Berlin Wall Memorial Park, the Bernauer Straße. Now, a lot of the wall has gone now, and this section was preserved and incorporated into a memorial park. So it's both a memorial and a park, which is a point I'll come to a bit later. The architects, Kohlhoff and Kohlhoff, chose a pretty unusual approach here. Now they kept parts of the wall, as you can see on the right, which hadn't entirely been chipped away by souvenir hunters. And they replaced other parts with Corten structures. Now these are rusted steel structures, which represent the wall without being the wall. And if I show you some other pictures, you'll see what I mean by a narrative tissue, a narrative substance which runs through a site. You can't show so easily where the tunnels were, but you can put in the narrative material, the narrative tissue in where the tunnel was. So the Corten appears as a dotted line along here, and then you get a little bit of information. The Corten appears where a watchtower used to be, and maybe where a guard stood. So this very original, rather curious idea is to replace parts of the site, which maybe no longer exist, with a symbol, with a three-dimensional diagram, which you then enter. And they explain the site and give you a spatial sense of it. So it's a very reduced, very sculptural way of going about it. Maybe not particularly emotional, but it certainly tells you what the landscape of the death strip was and what different elements it contained. And when you get up close, then it tells you in more detail with pictures and stories. And now you have the use as a park. And I find this quite interesting. The cognitive dissonance, on one hand, you have a death strip where people really were shot to death here and pursued by dogs and barbed wire and all the rest of it. And it's a somber memorial site. And on the other hand, you have the need of the local residents and other visitors to relax and have a bit of green in the city. So how do those things fit together, and do they really support each other? Well, they don't really, but I think this was probably a reason why the architect chose not to go for the dramatic pathos of narrative, explicit narrative on the site, but actually to have a low-key solution such as these Corten objects. And if you're interested in knowing more, then you go up close and then you can read about it and look at the links. The final example, before I go on to some critical points, is the Gleislinse, also in Berlin. I really like this project. It's on the site of an old railway shunting yard, which has no dramatic history attached to it. The more interesting aspect of it is the natural aspect. It's colonization by plant life and by insects and lizards and all kinds of interesting creatures. So it was going to be, or it is going to be developed for industry and for the science park on the right side here. And a part of it was is to be preserved in perpetuity as a landscape park, not in the English sense, but in the German sense of a landscape preservation. And Right, so what did the landscape architects do? They gave it a name, Gleislinse, and started off with a frame for what you're looking at, because we have a lot of these sites in Berlin, rather abandoned looking, and many people think, oh, it's uncared for, it's just a mess, and when is it going to be tidied up? So what the landscape architect can do is to establish an aesthetic which is like the ethic. The aesthetic sets down some rules which tell you this is actually good and interesting. And how do they do that here? They put in a path and do the path slightly in the form of a railway platform. And when you stand looking in that direction, because that's what you do when you're waiting for a train, what you're looking at the ecology, really. This is Little Fence for Lizards, which are being captured. And then further down, we have the old stones from the railway, combined with sand and stumps and all kinds of things which have been left lying or even arranged at that place. And you stand there and you know from your knowledge of waiting for train, you don't step over that line. And so the ecosystem is not damaged by the visitors, which is quite a clever subliminal trick, I think. And then you watch things develop, or you can just carry on along down the path. And then the aesthetic also allows for an awful lot of messiness, you know, cracks and old materials which belong to the historic fabric of the site. And they are qualified by one way or another, for example, turning blocks into benches or turning this rubble strip into a place for bicycles. And so it's qualifying what would otherwise be seen perhaps as a mess and making it into a park all of a sudden. So it's magic, really. And this is even more explicit framing, where the original railway track and a bit of lovely pioneer vegetation has been established or re-established as a tableau, and the sitting bench around it makes it very clear that this is a picture. It's something of value to look at, and the centerpiece of a newly established plaza or square where lots of people will be coming and going from work and from their homes over this bridge and onto the S-Bahn. And because there's no particular information available here, you're free to make your own discoveries and explore. The stimulus to explore and maybe see where the tracks lead is very exciting, not just for children in an abandoned site, but for adults who have a bit of curiosity. And it's a great thing if you can leave as much of the original as possible. And I will then finish off now with a few points from our well, a few observations from the projects and others which were sent in. On the left here, really the language of interpretation I've used in this talk applied to architectural sites. So we have the ethic and the immersion and the artistic interventions standing in for intangible heritage and so on. I won't go through all of them. You can maybe look at them while I'm talking about this side, which is where I would like to see some more intensive use of heritage interpretation in landscape architecture and architecture. And hopefully, if we can attract more architects and planners, landscape architects into Interpret Europe and get out the message of what heritage interpretation can achieve, then there will be more of this. I certainly try to do it in my own work as a landscape architect. So in all of these projects, I mean, they're lovely projects, but for me, there's not enough interactivity going on. And I haven't seen any examples of real engagement, of opportunities for local engagement, whether it's residents or businesses or local products or anything which can create a dynamic, ongoing relationship with the site. So a lot of these sites have set the site in concrete, as it were, frozen in a moment of time, and it would be nice to see more dynamic going on, where in the locality people can actually respond and come up with their own interpretations or changes, which is a difficult thing because some of them are not seen so positively, think of graffiti, but there must be ways and means. Fostering stewardship, that's something we like to do in heritage interpretation these days, and I'd like to see more of that in projects, because if we're talking about environmental ethic, it also means hands-on by the people, not just by the architects, that we are converted into active agents in the environment and agents of positive change. So not only a project is an agent of positive change, it reestablishes or rewilds perhaps, but also the visitors somehow. And that's not so easy, but I'm sure it's possible. And then providing alternative narratives. With the battlefield, we had a narrative, but it's more exciting, as you probably know, to bring alternative narratives and let people choose or explore them one after another. And then to provide more surprises and provocation. Some of the projects were very surprising and exciting. I think of the one in Hilversum in particular, the audiovisual one, but a lot of them for me are not exciting enough. There should be more provocation going on here. So if we're talking about experience, which you really do have a body experience when you walk into a site, it's not enough just to have a visual experience of something. In this case, in the background, we have a visual experience, but it would be great to have more physical body experiences with all the senses. And that's a great place to bring in the children, because a playground is very physical. And if you have elements of the site to be climbed on, to be tested, to be tried out, to be balanced on, to be sniffed, whatever, children understand that instinctively, but it's also something which we can and should bring for adult visitors. So that was my whistle-stop tour of the projects we've been looking at in the group. And I look forward to being able to show you the brochure when it's finished, when we've done the production, probably beginning of next year. And in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Angus. This was really, again, another interesting presentation from you and your team. How did you, you said you found how did you choose these examples?
Right, well, we wrote no, first we looked in the internet for interpretive sites, interpretive centers, and then chose the best ones. And then wrote to the architects and asked for pictures. And so it's just subjective, you know, we're still gathering examples, gathering our thoughts, finding a language. And so it's a fairly random collection here. These were the architects who were helpful and sent us nice photographs and a bit of text. Maybe eventually we'll have an idea of quality, a definition of quality in interpretive planning, but that's some way down the line. I think we're still in the collecting, in the hunting and gathering phase.
Yes, Helena asks, is this opportunity for upgrade or these good practices? So is there an opportunity for upgrade of these good practices?
Yep, maybe. I think interpretation is for me, it's a process which is very individual. Every guide, every designer, every artist interprets in their own way. And so I don't think we should ever try to have a definitive idea of best practice or a methodology. No, just inspiration and broadening of the horizons, so we see what's possible, what other people have done, and then you get inspired and do something different or even better yourself. But in order to be able to talk about interpretive architecture, you have to have the words, you have to have the terminology. And interestingly, most of our standard terminology can be applied to architecture. So I think, well, I hope that you recognize a lot of our standard terminology in my talk, and now being able to visualize it in terms of architecture and landscape architecture.
Yes, well, thank you. It was really interesting. I wish we had more time to discuss your talk and to like wrap up the today's day at the conference.